Okay, so here's something really important to understand if we're thinking about the study of Wesley and his theology. The work I'm doing, the way I try to explain and organize Wesley's thought, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's deeply connected to the work of someone who has been a massive influence on my own thinking, my mentor, Albert C. Outler. Now, if you haven't heard of him, let me give you a quick sense of why he matters. Outler was an incredible scholar, one of the most respected authorities on Wesley in the 20th century. He spent his life digging into the historical context of Wesley's writings, tracing his sources, and showing exactly how his thought developed over time. He was a historical theologian through and through. That means his main focus was on understanding Wesley and his place in history, what influenced him, what he read, how his ideas evolved, and he did this with remarkable precision and detail. By contrast, my own professional life has mostly been as a systematic theologian, which is a slightly different way of approaching things. Systematic theology is about taking all the pieces of Christian doctrine and trying to bring them together into a cohesive, comprehensive framework. It's more about seeing the structure, the connections, and the internal logic of theology, rather than tracing influences or placing ideas in historical context first. So here's the key point. My method and Outler's method are complementary. They're different approaches, but they work beautifully together. Outler's historical lens helps us understand where Wesley came from and why he wrote as he did. My systematic lens tries to show how his theology fits together in a cohesive way and what it means as a whole. Now, it's also important to note that the method I use leans a little more heavily on divine revelation as a guiding principle for theological study. What does that mean? Well, I take seriously the idea that God's revelation, the truths God has communicated to humanity, especially through Scripture and Christ, isn't just one piece of information among many. It's actually the foundation for understanding history itself. In other words, the sweep of universal history, the big story of humanity and God's interaction with the world, is meaningful because it's shaped and illuminated by revelation. Outler, on the other hand, focused more heavily on historical inquiry. That's not to say he ignored theological truths, far from it. He was deeply aware of them, but his work emphasized tracing evidence, understanding historical sources, and describing Wesley's development in its proper historical context. He didn't necessarily step back and ask, what does this reveal about God's purposes across time? And that's where my approach diverges a bit. I remain grateful for Outler's enormous contribution, seriously. His work is foundational, and without it, anything I do would be impossible. But I also allow myself a little more flexibility in what counts as evidence. I try to expand it to include what some scholars, like Wolfhart Pannenberg, have called revelation as history. That is, we can look at God's revelation as a real, historical force that shapes events and makes history intelligible, not just as abstract truths written in a book. Interestingly, while I now see this approach as consistent with Wesley's own teachings, I didn't fully grasp it until I studied Cyril the Great, one of the early church fathers. Studying Cyril helped me realize that Wesley wasn't inventing a system from scratch. He was participating in a long tradition that saw God's revelation as deeply interwoven with the world and history. So, here's the exciting and somewhat intimidating part. My goal in this project is to order Wesley's thought cohesively, comprehensively, and systematically. That's a big task, and it's worth noting that my beloved teacher, Outler, never tried to do exactly this. In fact, he may have looked at the idea a little skeptically, because his passion was historical accuracy rather than systematic synthesis. Outler's vocation was different but complementary. He wanted to provide an exhaustive placement of Wesley in his historical context. He showed, step by step, how Wesley's thought developed, what sources he drew on, and how his ideas were shaped by his time and place. And he did this exemplarily. His scholarship is thorough, precise, and incredibly reliable. He mapped out Wesley's world so that anyone coming after him could understand where Wesley's theology came from. My own work builds on that foundation. I stand on his shoulders, using his historical insights as the base for a systematic presentation. Basically, I take the solid groundwork he provided and try to arrange Wesley's theological ideas in a way that shows their cohesion and internal logic. It's like Outler built a map of the territory, and I'm trying to show how the roads and cities connect, how the theology all fits together in a living, meaningful whole. This project also presupposes the work of other historians who have contributed to what Outler called the third phase of Wesley studies. This was a period dominated by brilliant historical research, focusing on context, biography, and textual sources. These historians are amazing at what they do, but they mostly stop short of entering into the plausibility of Wesley's theological argument itself. In other words, they tell you what Wesley thought and why, but they don't necessarily explore how his exposition of Scripture could be taken seriously as a coherent theological system. And that's where my approach comes in, by combining Outler's historical precision with a systematic perspective that takes revelation seriously. I aim to show that Wesley's theology is not just a series of historically interesting ideas, but a cohesive, plausible, and deeply meaningful exposition of Christian faith. Put it in simpler terms, think of it like this. Outler gave us the blueprints, the history, the context, the development. My work is about taking those blueprints and assembling the house, showing how all the rooms fit together, how the structure holds up, and how it functions in daily life. Both approaches are essential. One without the other leaves the picture incomplete. I also like to emphasize that my method doesn't abandon historical rigor. I still pay attention to evidence, dates, sources, and textual analysis. I just widen the scope of what counts as relevant evidence to include the work of divine revelation in history, the way Wesley himself understood the unfolding of God's plan. This is a subtle but important point. History and theology are deeply intertwined. Wesley didn't think of his sermons and writings as abstract doctrines to be studied in isolation. They were lived theology, responding to God's revelation in the life of his people and in the course of events he witnessed. By taking this approach, we can see the systematic cohesion of Wesley's thought while remaining fully grounded in historical reality. Finally, I want to emphasize how much this work is built on gratitude. Outler's scholarship is incomparable. Without his meticulous historical work, no one could attempt a project like this with confidence. His insight, patience, and care for accuracy provide the foundation for any serious study of Wesley. But building on that foundation doesn't diminish Outler's contributions. On the contrary, it honors them. I am grateful for his example and his work. I simply extend it in a different direction, showing how Wesley's thought can also be appreciated systematically, not just historically. It's a complementary project, not a competing one. By doing this, I hope to reveal a fuller picture of Wesley, one that is historically grounded, theologically rich, and systematically coherent. In doing so, readers can appreciate Wesley not just as a historical figure, but as a theologian whose thought continues to speak to modern believers, just as it did to his own contemporaries.